We're having some technical problems getting it to display, but I guess while we're finishing setting up, I'll just go ahead and introduce us. So I'm Jenny Gibbons, and this is my partner, Malcolm Pierce of Woodsy Studio. So we've been around for about 6 years, going on 7, making visual novels. Oh, some progress. Oh, okay, so it looks like our presentation isn't completely loading right, but at least you'll see the text. So sorry about that. But yeah, so we make visual novels, so very narrative-heavy games, and we're actually working on our 8th game right now. So our general goal has been to release an average of 1 a year, and sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. So yeah, we want to tell you more about visual novels and why they're important to us. Let's see here. What is a visual novel?
All right, so a visual novel is, it is a format of video game that first popular in, probably you'd say in Japan, but you will see things like it in games. So if you think about what kind of adventure games are in the West, where you point-and-click adventure games like, the classic Monkey Island, things like that, they all sort of have this style where you control sort of a side-scrolling character, King's Quest, things like this, that you click around the screen, you explore in that way. Adventure games in Japan kind of evolved in a different fashion. One of the big things that you'll see that is sort of a signature of visual novels is the idea of these portrait characters in front of the screen with a text box as they're talking to you. That's like the big signature thing. That's how the adventure games in Japan look, and now we sort of think of those as visual novels. I always think that when we talk about our games, we sort of interchangeably use visual novel and adventure game, but because we do sort of embrace that portrait text box style, that's pretty much what we have sort of settled on as our style of game, is visual novels. Some ones that you might have heard of would be Ace Attorney or Clannad or Snatcher. That's precursor to some of the Metal Gear games by Hideo Kojima. You wouldn't think of him as somebody who makes visual novels, but if you play Snatcher, it's so very similar to the visual novels that you might see as sort of the classic ones like Clannad.
Yeah, and also, along with the visual element, what's really important to us, like we started as screenwriters, and to us, visual novels are games that make the narrative the primary focus, and like the interactivity is there, and it's important to like make it the player's experience, but the story takes the priority, the forefront. So there are lots of different genres within the visual novel format. Probably the one that like most people think of first is dating sims, because a lot of those are the most popular, and there are a whole bunch of them. Ones for all sorts of different tastes, and lots of subgenres. But there are lots of other kinds too. Mystery procedural are really good ones, like Danganronpa is what this screenshot is from, and the narrative lets you like put a mystery together and solve puzzles, and you can probably talk a little bit better about some of these other.
Yeah. And obviously, as with any storytelling format, you could have comedy visual novels, you could have drama visual novels, things like that. But the really popular ones and the ones that you often see do tend to fall into these categories that we've outlaid. Lots of dating sims, lots of romance, and sort of crime-solving games and horror games. There are actually a lot of horror visual novels, in part because they take a lot of inspiration from lots of horror manga. Again, this is a largely Japanese format, or at least it has been for most of the history of it. And so you'll see a lot of things that take a lot of inspiration from things like Junji Ito and things like that. Again, though, what we want to clarify that while we have laid these genres out as what you normally see, you can use the visual novel format to make any kind of story you want. And that's what we think is so, freeing about it, because it really is a storytelling format first and foremost, but also a game.
Yeah, and on that note, there are lots of games that I think are kind of borderline visual novels, And, you could definitely have a whole debate about that. They definitely have sections that follow the format of a visual novel, and they have like a really important story. So these are some that I'm sure you've heard of. Persona especially has a lot of visual novel elements, but it's got a very intense gameplay element. So you might not technically categorize it as a visual novel, but definitely borrows a lot.
Yeah, with the games we listed here, what's really interesting about them is that if you take a screenshot from one part of the game, you'll clearly identify it as like an RPG or a strategy game. But if you take a screenshot from several other parts of the game, it looks pretty much identical to a visual novel, up to the same portrait of the character with text box underneath it. Especially, I've been playing a lot of Fire Emblem lately, and like there are sections that are you're like, this is practically just a dating sim. But then there's also the gameplay elements of it, that the strategy gameplay. So it's clear that the format has really influenced other games, even really popular ones that have come over to the West recently and sort of exploded in popularity.
So there's a varying level of interactivity you might get in a visual novel. There are actually visual novels that fall into a category called kinetic novels, and really they're more just like a graphic novel that's digital, and it's a very linear story, hardly any interaction other than progressing through the text. So you can actually have it that simple, but above that is the interactive novels, where you generally have the choices that you make that branch the story into different paths, and on top of that you might have puzzles that you have to solve, exploration, mini games that you play. Danganronpa has like all these little mini games that you play while you're debating about the killer. So there are varying levels.
Sometimes I wish it wouldn't.
Huh?
Sometimes I wish it wouldn't, but
Yeah.
yes, it does. All right, so since the other part of this talk is how to make a visual novel, or at least the very, very basic outline of it, we want to talk a little bit about the options for engines for making visual novels, because we think that visual novels are a format that a lot of people can get into games with, because typically, if you're doing something that's mostly storytelling, there's going to be a lot less involved in worrying about like balancing gameplay, things like that. So it's a really good sort of starting off point or ending point if what you want to do is tell narrative style games or narrative stories in games. So here are some options for doing that.
All right, we'll go through these pretty quickly. Twine is just a really simple entry point that lets you just jump in. What's my favorite thing about Twine is just like the visualization of like branching story paths. So it's fun to play around with like your first interactive story. What we really recommend to people is RenPy. It's just a great free open source program. You don't have to worry much about programming right when you start. But if you get into programming, you can do a whole lot with it. It's Python based, which is a programming language I really like. And the interface is so easy to use. I would actually write my script right into the game engine because it just flows so well. And it just right off the bat will give you this, the classic visual novel look with characters in the front and your background and the text box at the very front. Then if you want to customize it, you learn some more programming, you can. It also exports easily to PC, Mac, Linux, Android. It exports very, very easily, and all of that's set up for you. Also great community support online. I actually got like a really great following for my first game because of the RenPy community.
Another option, if you're looking for something where you don't have to program, is a program called Toronto Builder. It requires even less programming knowledge probably than RenPy. Not that RenPy requires much at all, but you do start to see a little bit of code. This is all drag and drop and includes an asset library, and similar to RenPy, it exports to PC, Mac, Android, and iOS really easily. It unfortunately does cost $14.99 on Steam. RPG Maker is another option, especially if you want to have light RPG elements in it. The thing about RPG Maker is it's really great at making Super Nintendo-style RPGs, but not great at anything else, except it's pretty good at doing the sort of visual novel stuff once you hack it a little bit. It is $80, but don't buy it for $80. It goes on sale for $20 very often.
Yeah, on Steam, yes. So with the, your more intricate, higher level engines, Game Maker, Unity, Unreal Engine 4, you can also make visual novels. You might have to do a lot of the initial setup more on your own, but you can definitely use them. We created a visual novel in Game Maker. I don't strongly recommend getting too serious about Game Maker because we had a lot of export problems, but it depends on the size of your game and your goals for it. We had a few issues with it.
If your game is going to be fully voiced, don't use Game Maker.
No.
But otherwise, it might be fine. There's lots of sound files gets it really confused.
Unity, we personally haven't had much experience with Unity, but we've definitely seen a lot of visual novels come out of it. In Unreal Engine 4, you probably don't often hear that recommended, but as for making a visual novel, but we love Unreal Engine 4. It just can do so much. It's, easy to use. I don't want to say like you're just gonna like come in and know what to do, but it's got like a great interface, very intuitive. Lots of support. So the screenshot is from one of the visual novels that we've released and made in UE4, and we just love it. So yeah, we'll talk now about like the technical considerations that you need to think about when you're starting a visual novel, because because the story is the focus, like writing is the most important thing in a visual novel. You want to have a strong story. You want to practice your writing. You want to have great dialogue. But you actually do, even as a writer, need to think a bit about the technical considerations while you're working on your script and planning out the story. There's certain things that you need to think about when you're making a visual novel.
Yeah, I think that we mentioned earlier that we are originally writers before we made games, and so of course when we want to do a story like this or a screenplay or something, we default to that format, and we're just like, oh yeah, you just say the character name and then what they said. But you then have to figure out a way to get that into a game engine that'll read it, and that's not always easy unless you're using RenPy, in which case it is actually kind of easy. You can write directly into the program. If you see there on here up on the slide, I'm gesturing at the screen that you can't see. You'll note that it has like MIC surprised, oh, is that you, player name. That is like that. All that is that's the name, the sort of code name of the character, MIC, the expression that you would have them have on the screen, and then the text that's displayed. And then every time you hit return, it goes to the next line and changes the expression and changes the character if need be. It's really easy. It's really similar to doing something like play format. Except you wouldn't, just tell the actor, be surprised all the time. That's not great play formatting. But it's really easy to use in that way, and that's one of the reasons that we suggest it, is that if you're just starting out as somebody who is primarily a writer, you just basically write it like you're writing a script or a play.
Yes, so again, RenPy, awesome. But if you're not using RenPy, looks like this one formatted a little strangely. All right, so you'll just have to use your imagination. So we would start with like an open office script, so that you see there on the left. We would write it like that because that's how we're comfortable writing, like the character, cat, and what they say, meow. So what you can't see is that then we would turn it into really kind of ugly code. But we would do that, like once we had the script written, we would just do like a lot of like find and replace. And basically replace the names with the right like code and like semicolons and functions that needed to go into Game Maker. It was a little painful, but it worked. And so we just kind of had to figure that system out beforehand and know, okay, we can still write in the script, but then we need to kind of go through this process to bring it into Game Maker. And here's the result. Here's a screenshot from our Game Maker game, Echoes of the Fae, The Fox's Trail, which you will be able to play at the Gamerhood table after this presentation.
If you notice, the first line in it is cat meow. So if that doesn't make you want to play the game, I don't know what will. All right, and this again, please use your imagination. This would be our UE4 process. So we would start with a very similar script. Basically, we've just adjusted to that's how we write our visual novels. For UE4, though, what we wanted to do, we use data tables in UE4, which are basically converted CSV or Excel files. For this, we actually have a script that we wrote, that Jenny wrote, that takes our scripts like this. I've used script in two different ways, I'm sorry. We have a little program that we wrote, and it takes our scripts and it converts them into CSV files with the formatting that we need for Unreal to sort of handle it after that. Then we have, in our Unreal Engine framework, we have something that basically reads through those data tables as you click through. It started off more complicated than our Game Maker process, but ended up less complicated in large parts because there's the support for data tables in UE4.
Yeah, and on that note, automation tools are your friend. We probably waited way too long to try and make one just to automatically convert our scripts. And so, like, you know, if you do have some programming knowledge, I would recommend just like sitting down to make one, and it'll save you time in the future. And if not, get a programming friend, and hopefully it's something that only takes, like, you know, a few days to knock out, and then you're saving yourself hours and hours and hours down the road.
Or use RenPy.
Or use RenPy. And here's a screenshot from Echoes of the Fae, The Last Sacrament, which we made in UE4. Here's that line showing up on the screen.
All right, so this is something that we sort of discovered early on, or yes, I would say early on, especially once we moved from RenPy, actually, which is if you're doing branching paths, you're going to want to keep track of them, and we keep track of them with something that we've come to call a master choice log.
Yes, so the master choice log is something that I feel strongly about because it took me like 3 games to think of doing this, and it's something that I'm sure other programmers like figured out maybe right away, but for me it took a little while. And so the thing is, when you're making a visual novel, it becomes really hard to track all your choices. So what I recommend is just having an array dedicated to holding the values of your choices. And so here's in Unreal, it's creating a blank array at the beginning of the game that's 200 long. And in those entries, you're going to have like the index of the choice 1. Say there's 3 options, and the player picks number 3. And then that gets saved. 1 is the value of 3, and now you know that the player chose that on the first choice, and it's just a really nice way to track all of your choices. So just a technical note that has helped me.
Yeah, and it can be an array of any kind of variable, but we would strongly suggest integers instead of strings or something like that, because otherwise you get some confusing things. It might seem really nice for master choice log, 33, which is your romance choice to be the name of the character that you're romancing. But then when you go and you try and check that, if you make a typo, you're in trouble. So what we do is we have a second document that we keep track of that just says, master choice log, 1 equals tell Harriman the truth, 2 equals make up a new power, stuff like that, so that we just can reference that document while we're writing or we're coding, and we don't have to like keep track of a whole bunch of strings or values or anything like that in our heads.
Yep. And finally, think of the trees, think of the branching, and like it can be really easy when you're starting out to just have these like grandiose ideas of, oh, it's going to be like so dynamic and they can completely make their own experience and every choice will have its own unique path. And it's great to have that vision, but it gets really overwhelming and we want you to be able to finish your game. So try and start simply. Think about the simplest paths, the least amount of branching that will have still a good impact on the user experience and help them feel like they're inserting themselves somehow. Just, try and keep it small, and we have a few types of branching that you can do here, but we're low on time, so. Yeah,
like just keep in mind that every time you add a branch to something that's also branched, it's an exponential level of things that you both can play and also have to test. Very specifically, in in Echoes of the Fae the Fox's Trail, even now, I don't believe we've tested every possible combination of things that can happen at the end, not because we were lazy, but because it was literally impossible. So we just have to hope that if something goes wrong, someone will tell us.
We got a little carried away.
Yeah.
All right, so here's our contact info. We've got a booth where we're showing our current project, Crimson Spires, which is a horror romance about vampires in a fictional Missouri town. So yeah, come talk to us, and I don't know if we have time for any questions here. Anyone have something they really want to ask?
We are in that booth, so you can come ask us there, and we won't have to make Mel wave us off stage. You're gonna have to start playing the music, just like in the Academy Awards.
All right, well, thanks everybody, and good luck.
Thank you.